Today on Seahawks Forever, Jeff Simmons, co-host of Real Hawk Talk, joins me, and we're going to take a look ahead at the 2025 Seahawks. So much focus has been on 2024 with the new coaching staff and a lot of new players in place. But how does the roster shape up moving forward? How does it sit against the salary cap? And what issues might there be to deal with next year? Where are the shortcomings in talent? Where are the strengths? Who might be able to step up this year and establish themselves moving forward? And generally, how strong is the collection of talent on this roster as the Seahawks hope to move into a window of championship contention moving forward? Jeff Simmons talking 2025 roster today on the show.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
As always, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that bell button for notification of future episodes. You can subscribe on Spotify if you want to hear ad-free audio episodes. Otherwise, you can subscribe to the show on any audio platform. And you can also support the show with a super thanks or by buying me a coffee. All those links will be in the description. And really the best way to support the show, other than just being a subscriber, is commenting, engaging, being part of the conversation in the comments. Thank you so much for your reaction to the last video. Had some really, really great conversation and reaction to that. Taking a look at whether the Seahawks are being overlooked and undersold a little bit as we head into the 2024 season. But today is about looking ahead to the future. Jeff does such a great job with Brian Nemhauser and that crew and Dana O'Gorman and all those people over at Real Hawk Talk. Former media guy. He has some contacts around the league. And he's one of those guys that brings some levity to the conversation. And I think he has a very objective, balanced approach to it, where he's able to mix and match his emotion and intellect in making decisions on how he feels about certain things regarding the Seahawks. So let's talk about the future of the Seahawks today with Jeff Simmons. Jeff, welcome back. Let me lead with this. It's June. It is as much as the NFL tries to be 365, 24/7, June is the dead month, the deadest of months, especially after minicamp wraps up. Do you enjoy that? Is it a chance for you to kind of take a breath before training camp starts, or is it killing you right now?
I wish I enjoyed it. It's killing me. I was joking with you off air a little bit, but football, especially like following the Seahawks, has become like way too much of a part of my life. And just compared to how I used to follow other sports, and in Canada, there's not a lot of like where I live, there's not a lot of hardcore NFL people like me. People will follow during the year and during the draft, but like I put so much time into the draft, and then I really put so much time into just building up to it. Yeah. I always feel there's like a hole in my life after that ends. And I love the draft, and then the mini camp stuff helps a little bit, but yeah, I wish I could get more enjoyment out of this time. And I do things outside, and I love obviously the weather here, but just in terms of like my day-to-day, like the content I take in, there's a giant gap in my life right now, and it's hard to fill right now. Like it's a tough time for me, honestly.
Yeah, it's hard to find a rhythm. Like every year I promise myself, I'm like you, I'm a major draft nerd, and every year I promise myself that after the draft, I'll start prepping for the next draft. Like that's next year is going to be the year that I know 250 players deep, and I'm going to be more well-versed on prospects than ever before. But then, honestly, May and June come along, and it's like, you just naturally want to shift down a little bit. But then at the same time, got to keep the channel going, and the people demand content, right? So here we are. And today we're going to take a look ahead a little bit. I've been teasing this for a while now, and you and I have been trying to get together for a couple of weeks. Thanks for taking the time to come on the show. But I wanted to look ahead at the 2025 roster, because I felt like the culmination of these last three drafts in particular, when there's been a clear shift in how John Schneider and his staff have approached the draft. And I think pretty universally, we're all happy with the talent that we've accumulated over the last 3 years. And then the new coaching staff and some of the young players that have emerged, some of the guys that have been brought in as free agents. And I had just a general sense that I think we're building a pretty good window here and a foundation of young talent across the board that, you can build a championship contender here. And then when you look at it on paper, some things stand out and it becomes a little more clear. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. But before we do, give me your thoughts where it stands today. How good do you feel about the accumulation of talent across the board on the current roster?
I think they've done a really, really nice job. If you look at where they were coming out of 2021, which was Russell's last year with the team, they were really poorly built. And it wasn't just the years of draft misses. They just did not have a lot of core players at key spots. Like they had Dwayne Brown at left tackle. Their cornerbacks were like DJ Reed and I think it was like, it wasn't even Shaq Griffin was gone by that point. So maybe Sidney Jones, Trey Flowers.
Yep.
So the left tackle, quarterback, um, defensive end was older guys. It was Benson Mayoa, and they didn't have guys at core positions, and they had no position groups really. They were built for that win now with Russell, and they had and then 2021 had the potential to really unravel. Like it looked bleak if they didn't make that trade or they missed on the trade. They were in trouble. And the last 3 drafts, they've really built a foundation of young players. And usually teams who are in this like 7 to 9 win range are kind of what the Seahawks were before. That team that can't really figure it out. Like what Atlanta's been the last few years and what New Orleans is in now. They're the Derek Carr Saints are like, there's no real clear path out of it. The Seahawks are set up with a unique amount of young players. They need some of them to get better. And I think that's why the coaching staff, but what they really lacked, like if I talked to people around the league last year about their roster, people really liked where they were like 10 to 40. Like they had one of the best, but everyone said they don't have those top 5 blue chip guys. And I think we talked about it last year, middle of the season. Now with Witherspoon and with Murphy, and Murphy needs to hit, obviously.
Sure.
They have the building blocks that just weren't there. And I said, coming out of 2021, they didn't have any emerging, other than DK, really, any emerging blue chip kind of guys. DK hasn't become that blue. DK's been very good, don't get me wrong. But I'm talking best play, top 5 in the league at their position kind of players.
Right.
And now they have the combination of the young players that some of them need to get better, but they have those blue chip guys that are really set them up. There's still spots they need to get better at, and we're going to talk about this. But the combination of all the young talent they've accumulated plus those blue chip guys, there's a lot here to be excited about. And I think 2025 is a really interesting jumping off point because to me, in my mind, I think this year is sort of a transition year where you're going to see like, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, a little later, but what can you get out of certain guys? But if some of the things hit that I think the new coaching staff can do, I think 25 is the year where this team can really take that jump to the next level.
Yeah, you make a good point. It seemed like for, kind of a 4 or 5 year period there, the late teens into the early 20s, that they were always chasing certain position groups. You mentioned defensive end. They were always just throwing darts at a dartboard, trying to spackle together some sort of pass rush there. And it's, of course, it's been that way for the offense with the offensive line for a while. It was that way at corner for a while. And it just, they couldn't get ahead of it. Now, and when I put this chart up showing who's under contract for 2025, there's one position in particular that stands out, but not 2 or 3, or 4 or more. And so let's do that. Let's get into this. This I went strictly off over the cap. So what you see in green are players that are currently under contract for 2025. I left all the other names on the current 90-man roster, and there might be some guys at the bottom that have shifted in the last week. Because, they all have an opportunity to make the team and be part of the puzzle moving forward. Especially some of these young guys, some of the undrafted guys that are kind of intriguing from this year's class. As you look at this, it does kind of illustrate what we're talking about because you can see 3 and 4 deep at most positions, but there are a couple that stand out. And you mentioned one right away, right? Your eyes went right to linebacker.
And yeah, if you're objectively evaluating like the big view of this team, linebacker's a spot that's kind of gotten away from them. And this year, the draft not working out, it wasn't a very good linebacker class. It was actually known particularly bad. There was only really 2 guys that you could have drafted in the first 2 days that would have helped you there. And then they didn't re-sign Jordan Brooks. And, we can make a case whether that was smart or not, but they have really nothing there beyond Tyrese Knight. And even the guys they have are mostly one-year deal kind of flyer players. So that's a position group that they're going to essentially need to rebuild over the next couple of years. Luckily, their head coach is like the linebacker guru. So that's his specialty. So it's kind of interesting. That's probably their weakest. So maybe he can get more out of them, or maybe he's going to want to have a big part in kind of resetting up that next level of that team. But here's the thing. This is what the roster, like, if you look at the linebacker, like, that's what the roster looked like coming out of 2021 at left tackle, at right tackle, at running back, at defensive end, at outside linebacker. They've really shorted up. And if you're like honestly evaluating the league and where it's gone, like, the positions that are now being like not paid in the market are running back, inside linebacker, and safety. There's a couple inside linebackers that are true difference makers, like the Fred Warners. But a lot of the smarter teams have kind of taken their money out of there and shifted it to offensive and defensive line. And really, if you're looking at the obvious hole going into 2024, this chart is a perfect indication of it.
It does feel like this offseason was a reset as far as payroll allocation goes.
Yes.
Getting it out of that safety group that was just killing them. And obviously there's still some dead money that they're having to account for this year.
Yeah.
But resetting that in 2025 won't be an issue. And they'll be able to shift some of that to other positions. And I think you make a good point about inside linebacker. It is one of those positions where payroll wise, it's been devalued a little bit. You can find solid players on the open market. I do get the sense now they got to get healthy, right? We didn't see Jerome Baker, Terrell Dotson at all in OTAs or minicamp. Mike Macdonald seemed to indicate that he's optimistic they'll be ready for training camp. If those guys are healthy, do you get the sense that at least at that position, that maybe those two guys are sort of competing to see who's worthy of an extension, that they'd like to keep one of those guys beyond this year and not have both of them leave?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because it'd been curious to me why John Schneider and the previous cap guy had done so many one-year deals. I thought it was just things had gotten away from them. And Schneider's doing that radio show now on ESPN 710. And he actually said all the one-year deals, which I haven't loved from like a cap perspective. They say they do a lot of them by design. When they're bringing in outside players, Schneider said that they like to do the one-year deal to see if they fit in the building. And then if the player fits, they'll give a big extension out after. That's their logic. Conversely, I can't think of many scenarios where that's worked. I think Michael Bennett, there was one year where he was brought in the one-year deal. They signed him at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Or maybe Avrill's deal got an early extension, but
because Averill was a 2-year deal when they signed
Averill was a 2-year deal. They handed him out an extension.
Yeah.
But there isn't really a lot of examples where that has worked.
Right.
So I found it a little curious that they continue to do that. I wonder if the new cap guy will change that, but it's consistent with what John has said he believes. And I guess he wants to see Baker and Dotson in the program. There's reasons both of them came through the market. Baker had injury issues. He played really, really well when he was healthy. Dotson was a practice squad guy that elevated it last year and became the starter because of the injuries and showed really well. But he's never played really more than 6 games at this level. So they made sense from a Flyer perspective. I advocate for them to find those kind of guys. But based on what Schneider said, that's their approach to a lot of these spots. They want to see. They don't often make the move like they did with Draymond Jones last year, where they hand out 2 big years. There's not a lot of examples of that.
Yeah. And then I guess the other position that kind of stands out is center, just because Olu Oluwatimi is the only guy under contract currently for 2025. And I guess if he plays well, it's not a big concern because backup centers are easy to find, right? And even Christian Haynes has played some center. You can cross-train some guys. Nick Harris is a guy that's not ever going to command a big deal in the open market, so he might be a guy you could continue to bring back. But when I look at this at first glance, and we talk about positives, you got to talk about the skill positions, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that you have to like the best about this roster is what they've accumulated at the skill position. The really interesting decision with the skill position is going to be next year with DK Metcalf. This year, you don't have to worry about it, but 2025 is the last year of his deal. And we've seen what's happened to the wide receiver market this offseason. it's went to a territory that I didn't think. And then Justin Jefferson took it to a whole nother. But there's still a bunch of Jamar Chase still has to sign. CeeDee Lamb still has to sign. I think the story coming out of next season is going to be around DK Metcalf. And I think this is such an important year of his career because, Tyler Lockett's deal is set up. I don't think Tyler Lockett will be on the roster next year unless he completely has a year where he kind of resembles. But a lot of the time and you mentioned over the cap earlier, when you bring up over the cap, you can get an idea of what a team's thinking by looking at their 2025 contracts. Like last year, we could tell Quandre Diggs was in trouble.
Yeah.
Or you could tell before they did the restructure, Draymond Jones seemed to be in trouble. And you can kind of tell based on dead money, and Tyler Lockett's deal gets, and that's why I thought it was so important last year when they did draft Jackson Smith and Jigba. I thought, okay, there's two huge cap numbers at wide receiver. They need to get a rookie contract in there. And I actually thought Jackson Smith and Jigba would be off the board when they picked at 20. So Zay Flowers was actually the guy that I had been kind of focusing on. And it turns out the Seahawks had a lot of people in the building that thought they were going to draft Zay Flowers. They didn't think Smith and Jigba would be there. So I think they've done a really nice job. Tight end looked really troubling coming out of last year.
Mm-hmm.
They had all three of their tight ends. I know two of their tight ends, Fant and Parkinson, were free agents. And Will Dissly, remember I said before about those over the cap, you can see clearly in Disley's contract that third year was kind of funny money.
Yeah.
It was set up to be cut. So this year, I knew they were going to prioritize drafting a receiver. But you look at all these spots, and even the offensive line, you can see all these young guys. They have potentially 4 to 5 guys on rookie contracts that are going to be valuable for them. So they're set up really well on offense. All the pieces are there. They just need to get more out of some of those offensive linemen. But the running back group, the receiver group, but I think this is a huge year for DK Metcalf for a number of reasons. I think Ryan Grubb, big year for him. I think can he take that step forward? But with his contract situation coming up, if he kind of levels out or peters out, they could look at trading him. So that receiver spot's going to look really, really interesting next year.
Yeah, and just this morning I saw a piece on ESPN from Bill Barnwell where he was talking about how that next contract for DK is going to be tougher than the last one was to sign him to. Obviously, as the needle continues to point upward for receiver salaries, even guys that are wide receiver twos on their own team are getting massive money, guys like Jaden Waddle. And it will be a tipping point, but it's also, as we're going to look at a little bit later when we see the cap calculator, if everything does click with DK, it will present an opportunity for them if he's willing to do an extension and stay here to free up some cap space and do some other things. I always have felt for the last 2 years, and especially after they did the restructure last year with him, that any extension, if it happens with DK Metcalf, is going to coincide with, as you touched on, Tyler falling off the books. And so if DK signs a massive, big time extension, it'll coincide with Tyler Lockett's cap hit going away. Exactly. and taking advantage of that JSN rookie contract. So, and then, obviously the Seahawks in a unique position with 2 quarterbacks that have extensive experience starting in the NFL under contract for 2025. And Geno Smith is a guy that it's fascinating to me how it seems to me anyway, tell me if you think I'm wrong, that the narrative around Geno has shifted a little bit in the last few months. When the coaching change was first made, when this offseason was commenced and the deadlines passed where they could have gotten out of his contract and saved a bunch of money, that as it became clear that this team believed in Geno and was committed to him, and now even, the messaging we're hearing from Mike Macdonald seems to be more and more positive every time he talks about Geno, that the narrative seems to have shifted. His detractors seem to have gotten a little more quiet. And the people that believe that he is at minimum a very solid option at quarterback for now and has an opportunity with a good year to now be an extension candidate, and a guy that if he goes out and clicks in this Ryan Grubb offense and this team wins, that now we're talking about extending him instead of cutting him to save money. Is that how you feel?
This is such an important, I can't emphasize this enough. This is such an important year for Geno Smith in Seattle. And if you look at where the quarterback salaries have gone, we saw Trevor Lawrence got $55 million a year. Brock Purdy's going to sign next year. All these guys, Geno Smith is the average value of his contract's $25 million. His cap hit So in terms of like a bargain, Geno Smith, even if you don't like him, is one of the true middle-class him and Baker Mayfield are the only middle-class quarterbacks in the NFL in terms of their contract. And I give John a lot of credit for how he designed that contract, because alternatively, the Giants did the Daniel Jones contract, and that was the one that worried me. They had and Daniel Jones is like $42 million this year, and they'd probably love to get out of that money. And Geno Smith, you're right. The team had some weird messaging about him at the beginning of the offseason. Some wondered if they were going to trade him. And honestly, if you're probably knowing the inside outs of the organization, Geno was more of probably a Pete guy than a John guy. I think John had been looking for that big toolsier quarterback. I think Geno was everything Pete was about: competition, getting the most out of your talent. But his contract is still pretty clean to get out of next year.
Yeah.
So I think this is, and the messaging of how they talked about how Geno needs to take the next step and how he needs to become more of like have some more poise and like the heat of the battle. Like the wording and the messaging from Macdonald has been pretty clear. Like they've now gone from like, well, we want to bring back Drew Lock to now Geno's the clear starter. So I thought the messaging on Drew Lock was really, really weird. But Howell, he's on a rookie contract for another year. So if they want to get out and make Howell the starter, we'll probably know by the end of this year. But I think this is a huge year, because if Geno plays well, and there's a lot of people that have Geno's skill set is very similar to Michael Penix. Obviously, one's a lefty, one's a righty.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of what they do well is very similar. And like the advanced numbers and some of the advanced stats are very favorable to Geno. But it's really watching him play. You just see there's a difference when he gets good protection and when he doesn't. He's like a completely different player. And it's sort of what Jared Goff is. Jared Goff, when he gets great protection, he has the best offensive line in the league in Detroit. He's now was a play away from winning that team to a Super Bowl. And when Jared Goff didn't get good protection, he was kind of a mess. He was up and down. Geno's been a streakier player, where first year in 2022, he had that first 8 games, then he fell off, reversed last year. But he's really, with this offense, if they can protect, Geno has a potential to play himself into an extension, because his value relative to the quarterback market is so good. His age makes it a little tricky, but
yeah, when you look at Baker's deal, 3 years, $100 million total value. I think most Seahawks fans would agree, if he has a good year, that they could live with that amount of money, but there's a big age difference between Baker and Geno. So you wonder, the deals that are going to be signed between now and then could change. And it's gotten so crazy that, one of the topics this week, one of the big news stories around the league is that teams and the players union are talking about potentially capping quarterback salaries and tying it to a percentage of cap, which is interesting. And especially interesting considering, to my knowledge, the first agent that ever actively spoke with teams about that concept was Mark Rodgers.
Yeah.
With Russell Wilson, where he was trying to get that done. It'd be kind of ironic if that ended up being the way that the league goes ultimately. And then some interesting developments at running back this year, and some things will clear up, with Ken Walker's status if he has a big year, because Ramondre Stevenson just signed his deal, 4 years, $36 million.
Yeah, I believe that was it.
And to me, that kind of sets the market. We're seeing kind of that $8 million a year, $8 to $9 million a year, really almost being the maximum value for a running back these days. Even I think that's about what Josh Jacobs got, isn't it, on the open market? So that will tell as well. And then you mentioned offensive line. The thing that I think we talk about chasing positions. It's been such an issue. I did a show with the guys from Hawks Own Rundown podcast yesterday, Bryce and Ryan, and we did an all-time Seahawks team. And the hardest thing to do was to choose a center 1, center 2, right guard 1, right guard 2, right tackle 1, right tackle 2. That for as long as this has been a narrative through the Super Bowl years that the Seahawks have struggled up front on offense, it's been a 40-year issue. That it was really hard to find guys from the center out. It was a little easier at center. There's some guys that have stood out over the years, but right guard, right tackle was really hard to find some obvious choices for all timers. But now you see that the collection, the pure volume of talent that they're adding to this group, especially if we get Abe Lucas to come back anywhere close to what he was, and he's able to play a full season, that for the first time, maybe in at least the John Schneider era, we're seeing the building blocks of a long-term position group here.
It's absolutely true. I've been so critical of how they've built this group for almost 10 years now. And I still would like to see a little more something established. Like, you could talk about all the young players they have, but there's not one thing you can hang your hat on right now.
No.
Which is a little scary. But you got Cross and Lucas at tackle. If Lucas comes back healthy, Lucas was better than Cross as a rookie. He looked like the highest ceiling player on the team. And then you have Haynes and Oluwatimi. And I think Haynes is a guy that I really liked with that draft pick. I think he's the kind of guy they need. They need stability. They don't need the blue chip guys everywhere. They need just a good guard. Like, when was the last time they had a good guard?
Yeah.
Not a great guard, just a good, like, Mike Upadhyay showed flashes when they had him a little bit, but
I mean, the Carolina Panthers think that Damian Lewis is a good guard. They paid him a lot of money.
Well, I don't agree with that. He's just so up and down. But that's what I think Scott Huff, and there's been some really promising things I've heard about Scott Huff from camp. I know Ray Roberts has talked about this, and I know Duke Manyweather has been really impressed with Scott Huff. Apparently, he's teaching details differently than a lot of the offensive line coaches. So this is a story that I know I'm going to convince myself into all summer. But offensive line coach is one of the most important positions on a coaching staff. And if Scott Huff can do what he did, turning the Washington O-line into the number one line in college football, I think player like projection, coaching, guys like Cross, Oluwatimi, and Haynes, it's going to be so interesting over the next year or so to see those guys develop. Because if those guys can be stable pieces on this offensive line, I think there's no position group that impacts the ceiling of this team more than how those three players, and add Lucas to the group, develop. Yeah.
And it's interesting to see that how quiet the narrative around the center position has been this offseason. It just feels to me, and it felt this way from the day they drafted him, because I felt like Schneider's comments about Oluwatimi the night they drafted him were about as strong as any of his comments about guys in that class. That he really felt strongly about him as a player, and that they really, Nick Harris isn't a guy who has 17 game starter ceiling. He's just not that guy, in my opinion. Like, they bring him in because he's familiar with Scott Huff. He can play center. He can play guard. He can win in a pinch, but he's not a guy that you come in with anything more than lip service as far as he's going to compete with Oluwatimi to be the full-time starter. I just don't think he's that guy, and that they believe he's that guy. Now, if he gets injured or if he just fails to perform, now you might be out actually on the market looking for a guy. But man, you look at this offense, and it's comforting to think that, assuming that we can keep Ryan Grubb around for a couple of years, like if he blows up and has a Bobby Slowick type of season in his first year as an offensive coordinator, maybe we're having a different conversation next offseason. But you look at this group and you know that all of those green names are coming back in 2025. It reminds me of something that Mike Holmgren used to talk about. When he came out after he had been out of the organization for a while, he did an interview where he reflected back on his time as general manager and head coach of the Seahawks. And he said the mistake he made in building the roster initially as the general manager, which ultimately got him stripped of that title, was he said he did it backwards. He drafted for offense and signed free agents for defense. And he said, if I could do it all over again, I would do it differently, because you need young, hungry guys on defense that haven't been paid yet. And on offense, you need continuity. And I look at this group and I think 2025, second year in the system, this has a chance to really, really be a good group.
Yeah, it's such a good point, because they've been just doing that year-to-year switch at center really since Justin Britt left, too. Justin Britt was a fine player, but he wasn't anything special. I get the sense internally they're really comfortable with Oluwatimi. I think you alluded to it before. I know Steve Hutchinson was very high on him when they drafted him last year. And when you saw him play in glimpses, he looked like a guy who saw the game really well. He was smart, and that's really important from the center spot. He could pass protect, which is a tough thing from an Seahawks offensive line perspective. Just physical point of attack, he struggled a little bit, and he wasn't a good run blocker. His grades indicated that. So I think he was one of the better pass protecting centers of any rookie last year on the offensive line. And I think if they work on his run blocking and get his lower body a little bit stronger, I think they're really comfortable with him at center. And he's a guy I think I've heard Scott Huff really likes, and they have some crossover from the Michigan coaching staff. I was with him for 1 year, but he's a guy I think could just be a really, really solid center. If he can become a good run blocker, his ceiling is really high. But yeah, you look at the continuity that could potentially develop here. That's why Christian Haynes falling to them the way he did.
Yeah.
If he didn't slip to them, that could have been a really bleak. That could be like the interior. And I think LeMayo was a good dart thrower where they got him. But Bradford's a guy, when they drafted him last year, he looked like a project. He was like an athletic, like he had like freakish athletic build skills for his size. But he looked a little out of shape last year, and he performed really poorly. And he probably got put into duty too much. But if you just look at this group, even just getting George Fant in the building, they lost games last year because of how bad their right tackle play was. Like, do you remember the Bengals game last year?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone blamed Geno for that. They lost that game because Jake Curran at right tackle
could not block. They just couldn't protect anyone.
He could not block Sam Hubbard. Sam Hubbard had 8 pressures in a row, I think. And he's not a guy who generates like a ton of. He's a good player, but nothing special. And just putting George Fant in the building, who was a starting right tackle on a playoff team last year, you see the signs of like a good group. And I think that was one of the things they had to do this offseason was hedge against Lucas a little bit. And now you have those young players and the 3 names at guard there. You have some upside, you have some stability, you have guys, and they're all on rookie deals. And so if this group, and I think the biggest thing for this group, other than Lucas coming back, is can Charles Cross take that next step?
Yeah.
And if Huff and this group can get Charles Cross to take that next step, I think this group has a pretty good ceiling.
And I feel like the ability is there for Cross. I wonder if that toe, just continuing to bother him. That's a tough injury to overcome, especially at that position. And the interesting thing about the George Fant signing is I think it may have been maybe the shrewdest, most important signing of the offseason in some ways. And yet we hope he doesn't play.
You're not wrong.
Right? I mean, maybe he dusts off the old jumbo tight end chops and they use him that way. But yeah, the ultimate definition of insurance signing for George Fant there. And then I'm really intrigued when I look at this secondary group, because going into the draft, like I literally, when I tried to study some tape and kind of familiarize myself with the draft class this year, I didn't watch any corners. Well, I won't say that. I watched a couple of guys that I thought might be in play at the end of the first round if they should trade down. And, I watched some Cooper DeJean and some Ennis Rakestraw, guys like that. But I didn't really study it deep. I certainly didn't watch any DJ James or Nehemiah Pritchett and just didn't think that was a direction they would go, let alone double dip. And yet they get these 2 guys, and then both these guys end up showing up on a lot of lists of players that were underdrafted, that were, ranked a lot higher and were great value picks. And now it completely changes the spectrum of what we're looking at here for 2025. If those 2 names aren't on the list, if they ignore corner in the draft, you're looking at Reek and Devin Witherspoon, and then you're going to have to spend some money at corner. To me, that was kind of a game changer when it comes to that back end.
I was going to say, if you take those 2 green names at the bottom off that list, there's a lot of white in that cornerback group.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought corner was a sneaky middle of the draft need, but I don't think they would have guessed that they'd come out with 2 of them. And I think they both fell, from what I understand, a round or 2. DJ James was a round or 2 later than they had him. And so all of a sudden, guys like Trey Brown, who might have been a must-sign player, they have a lot more leverage in something like that, where if those guys can play, if Pritchett and James can play, they have a group that's going to be cost-effective for a long time, and that's a real strength. But guys like Mike Jackson and Trey Brown, they might have been the biggest losers from the Seahawks perspective of who might get an extension or who has less value on the roster. And yeah. It was interesting because around the draft time, there was a lot of chatter. Like I think Daniel Jeremiah had it that he gave them the corner in the first round. And I was very nervous about that. And
there was a lot of DeJean chatter, near the.
And I think he had Terry Arnold going to Seattle in his final mock draft. And after the draft, Schneider was raving about Quinyon Mitchell and Terry Arnold being drafted by Philly and Detroit. And I was like, if Byron Murphy wasn't there, they might have taken a corner in the first round. And it probably would have been a trade back. But
yeah,
man, their whole outlook. And the draft is a lot of luck. Like the Texans last year wanted to draft Bryce Young, and they won the last game of the year.
Wow.
And now how much different would their franchise be? If they lost that game to the Colts, they would have ended up with Bryce Young and they would be nowhere. It's unbelievable. So Byron Murphy setting up this domino effect that prevented them. They might have taken a corner in the first round, and we'd feel a lot differently about their offseason if they just had Terry Arnoldson there instead of Byron Murphy. But yeah, you're not wrong. The cornerback group looks really strong. They don't have to pay a Woolen or a Witherspoon for quite a while now.
Yeah.
So they're really cost controlled there. They can hunt their money into and right now they got, I think, 35 million in dead money at safety. So there's a lot of cost potential to kind of build up this group in the next couple of years. And as the money has shifted towards Leonard Williams and Chenna Nwosu's extension, and Boya Mafe might get an extension at some point soon, but they have a lot of interesting, and having that cost certainty at corner, which is another position group that's skyrocketed in value, it's one of the biggest competitive edges for the Seahawks roster right now.
And then when we look up front, at first glance, you might see, okay, there's 8 names there across the front, including outside linebacker in kind of a scheme versatile front. But there's a pretty thin margin for error there. I feel like there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know about Cam Young. We don't know about Mike Morris. We don't know about Draymond Jones fitting into this system, and maybe there's a position change. And maybe when we do this exercise next year, he might actually be listed under the outside linebacker spot. We don't know about Derek Hall. Is he poised to take a set? So there could be a lot of question marks here that need to be answered this year. Whereas, 8 guys under contracts, it's great. And especially when you have one of them is such a reliable veteran like Leonard Williams. It was huge to bring him back in free agency. And then to get Byron Murphy, if they don't take him, if they go the other direction, like you were talking about, then we might be a little nervous about this position group. But there's some opportunity here for some of these young guys to be part of this puzzle.
Yeah, they're really well built up front right now, especially if you listen to Mike Macdonald talk. And I first listened to this, Joel Klatt was talking about it early in the offseason. He knew Macdonald from Michigan doing his college games. He said the one thing Macdonald always told him when he was Michigan's defensive coordinator is the starting point of his defense is building a run wall with defensive tackles, which is really different with how John Schneider's built the group. He's kind of built that group on the cheap really well, and he's found guys like Tony McDaniel and Al Woods, and he's been really good
Alan
historically.
Branch.
Yeah, Alan Branch. Who's the guy that Clinton McDonald they got? Yeah. He's done Afiba Rubin. Like, he's done a really good job at it. McDonald and Baltimore do it differently. They want big bodies, and they want a lot of them. And so they got right there, Jonathan Hankins and Jaron Reed are like perfect fits for what Baltimore did. Hankins especially. And they signed him for like a $3 million 1-year deal. And so Byron Murphy was a guy that Maclad, I remember at the time, said they're going to love him. McDonald's going to love him. He's the perfect player. And then it became to the point where like, okay, this guy's not making it to 16, but they're really set up to have that kind of run wall with defensive tackles. Leonard Williams, who can now play multiple, I think 6 or 7 spots now on the defensive line. And
yeah, that's what he says.
So you have the flex, you have the bodies, you have the versatility, and their defensive tackle group. If you can go Reed and Williams at end with Hankins and Murphy in the middle and kind of have the different sets for runs and deep, they're set up for short term. They're set up for the long term. And then they have this flexibility to kind of move Draymond Jones into and it was really interesting when they did their pre-draft press conference. It wasn't the GM, it was the scouting staff talking.
Right.
The first name they mentioned was Draymond Jones, which shocked me. And they must have been looking at this like the coaches completely misused him last year. It was the highest they've ever spent. So they got all these bodies to build this run wall. And then they could kind of use Draymond Jones, how clowny was he last year in Baltimore. They got a really interesting group. And then we haven't even talked about Mike Morris and Cam Young, who were last year supposed to be important parts of their group. And they know Morris from Michigan. They coached more. Mike Macdonald has coached Morris before.
Yep.
And Cam Young was a guy that they thought would be the starting nose tackle last year. He got banged up a little bit. And Jaron Reed played well at nose tackle. I think I bet the front office was shocked that that's how he was utilized. But that's a thing where sometimes the front office will sign someone. And I get the sense there were some butting heads over the last couple of years of how players were used. And one of the things Macdonald did amazingly well last year was player utilization, especially with defensive players. Well, he was the defensive coach. So take a guy like Jamin Clowney, who was trending to like being out of the league, he had the best year of his career.
Yeah.
And Kyle Van Noy was signed off the street. He had like almost double-digit sacks. And Justin Matabuke became a $25 million player. And you look at how this group looks, they're set up between defensive tackle, the kind of defensive ends they want in the system, and that outside linebacker group. It's a really fun group. They are set up really well for the short term, really well for the long term. And I think that almost more than anything is what I'm watching this year at the defense. Can you get more out of Derek Hall? Can Boye Mafe take the next step? What's Draymond Jones going to be? Because we know what Leonard Williams, Chenna, we have an idea what those guys are going to be. But if they can kind of take those guys to the next level, and it might take time, then they're going to be a front that's going to be really potentially dominant in this NFC West.
And I think even though Jaron Reed is on an expiring contract, he's, he was so excited to come back here for a second tour. He loves it here so much. If he's a fit in this defense, I see no reason to think why they wouldn't want to bring him back and why he wouldn't be open to coming back next year. And he wouldn't be a very expensive sign.
And I've been shocked. If you listen to Byron Murphy do his radio interviews, and I heard Mike Morris on with the Inverness, they said the type A guy in the room, the guy who's leading them around, is Jaron Reed. Mm-hmm. Byron Murphy said he's following Reed around the building, hanging out with him on weekends. I did not realize he was that type of influence in the room, especially in a room with Leonard Williams and some other veterans, Jonathan Hankins. Apparently, like, the lead dog is Jaron Reed. And Morris was saying he, more than any other player, is going to take a jump in this defense. So Reed was playing nose tackle last year, where you had Hankins, where his like on and off splits for Dallas are remarkable in terms of how good he was for their run defense. So I did not realize that about Reed. That's something I've learned in the last couple of weeks. And as you said, if there's someone who you think might resign that I wouldn't have guessed, he's probably it.
It's interesting you say that, because last year I had Corbin Smith on during training camp. And he said his initial impression of last year's camp was it was the most physical and intense camp he had seen in years. And the two guys that spearheaded that were Devin Witherspoon and Jaron Reed, that they were tone setters and that they made a difference. So I was as surprised to hear that then as you are with what you just described. So we could have maybe put him in light green. Let me pull this up as well here. Sorry, I thought I had this all queued up.
You're ready for taxes, at least.
Yeah. This is what the salary cap calculator looks like for next season. And you can see it's very top heavy, right? So you look at the top, there are 6 cap hits over $20 million. We're talking Nwosu, Williams, Draymond Jones, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, Geno Smith. They're currently $20.5 million over the salary cap. But those are 6 contracts that can all be dealt with and clear quite a bit of space moving forward. I really don't have any concerns about their salary cap position moving forward 2025 and beyond. Do you?
No, it's set up very clearly. I know some people are worried that the offseason will look like this year, but they don't have a lot of people to pay for the next year. And you can see, like I said before, if you play enough on over the cap, you can see exactly what a team's thinking. And it's actually pretty unbelievable. The more I've studied the NFL, this website alone can tell you exactly what a team's thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see right now, like, where they can get out. Before Draymond Jones got that kind of restructure, he was in like the do or die season, but Geno, Lockett, if Metcalf signs an extension, it's going to really lower his cap number. So the first year of a new extension, the year one cap hit is always really, really low. So they, like you said, there's easily ways other than Williams and Nwosu, who's their contracts were set up to take the big hits while they have those rookie contracts. It kind of coincides where you have Witherspoon's still really cheap. Cross is still relatively cheap. Jason Myers, you can get out of his deal. Like, it's really clear. And then they have all those other guys on low-level rookie deals. So I think they're set up to do whatever they want. And they have a new cap guy who's going to structure things a little bit differently. So that's something for us to watch. But if you look at, like, the guys they need to sign, there's not a lot of big deals coming. It's Laken Tomlinson, Jerome Baker, Julian Love, Jaron Reed, Jonathan Hankins, Tyrell Dodson.
Yeah.
That's it. So you don't have any big cap hits coming unless they're active in free agency or make a trade. And there's clear ways to either get out of Lockett's deal, lower Metcalf's contract. Geno, if they extend him, they'll lower his number. Leonard Williams. There's all kinds of cap manipulation. So I think they're set up pretty cleanly. And that's without the cap going up yet. So the cap's going to go up again, most likely, because of all the revenue come in. And again, we got so focused on saving money for IR. The cap is sort of like a mortgage. Like, it can be restructured in a million different ways. It's like a credit card bill. But no, I'm with you. I think that those top heavy guys, for the most part of the top, if they need to clear some of those guys out, they can. If they need to extend them, they can. There's a lot of manipulation that John and the new cap guy will be doing for next year.
Well, and you make a good point. They're $20 million over the cap for 25 as we sit now, but the cap could very reasonably go up 20 million, and they could be flush. And you make a good point too about the cap guy, Joey Lane. Is that his name? I think
it's Joey Lane. Yeah.
They've done things differently this year. They offered more guaranteed money to undrafted free agents, which I think helped them attract the best class they've had in quite a while, and maybe help them on the recruiting trail. They, in redoing Draymond Jones' deal, did void years, which they've been hesitant to do in the past. They only used void years, if I can recall, during the COVID year when the cap was stagnant and they kind of had to get creative.
Yes.
If he's willing to be a little more creative, and clearly John Schneider is allowing him to do things differently, then things could even get more exciting, as long as we don't get too carried away with it and, do the New Orleans Saints thing where you just don't even care. You just keep maxing out the credit cards and hoping you'll figure it out, taking payday loans down the road, to use an analogy. But yeah, this was fun. I think it was cool to have this conversation. The reason I wanted to have it, not talking about win-loss records, not talking about expectations about what happens on the field, but just roster construction and accumulation of talent. The late, great John Clayton used to always say that the NFL is a talent acquisition league, and that for the most part, obviously coaching comes into play, and it depends. You have to have a quarterback, but for the most part, the teams with the most talent have a chance to win. And as simplistic as that sounds, and I feel like for the first time in a long time, we can look ahead just like you and I did and see that there's a young foundation with a potential championship contention ceiling in place that this new coaching staff can work with.
Yeah, it's by far the thing I'm most encouraged about, where this team's going. That's why this year, I've said it a couple times, like, I'm not worried about wins and losses. I think that they have a complicated coaching staff coming in. It's going to take time. My mindset is, by the end of the year, are they peaking towards that championship contention window? And by the end of the year, and it took them 2 years in Baltimore, where year 2, it really hit in that defense, and they became a championship level team. And by the end of this year, I'm hoping that they're on that track. And if guys like Charles Cross and Tariq Woolen and some of the other guys take that next step, their influx of talent, I think Smith and Jigba is going to take a big jump this year, so does everyone else. So that's not a bold take. But Oluwatimi and Boye Mafe and Derek Hall, if they have all these guys going at the same time and then another draft class, they're set up. And man, if you want to feel better about the Seahawks, go on our lads and look what their depth chart looked coming out of 2021.
It's not pretty.
It's not pretty. I was talking to some of my guys on my show at that time. I'm like, we're going to suck for 10 years. Like if you remember, like the Bills after Jim Kelly until they got Josh Allen, like that was 20-year period of just nothing. Like kind of what the Tennessee Titans are now. And it looked like they were screwed. And these last 3 drafts have completely reshaped the organization. If they whiff on Witherspoon or they take Tyree Wilson or something like that, they'd be looking completely different. So they're really set up to kind of skyrocket if some of these young players can get better. And 2025 is the year I really think this team can really hit, especially as the Niners, I think, start to come down a little bit. Yeah. Matthew Stafford's going to be a little older. I think they're really positioned well. So when you said doing the show, like I think it makes a ton of sense from the Seahawks perspective. So that's why I'm not worried about like whether they win 7 or 10 games this year. I just want to see that they're trending towards that level by the end.
That's exactly what I've been saying for the last, since Mike Macdonald was hired, since the coaching change was executed. We'll see if I still feel that way once the season starts and emotion gets involved, and maybe you win a couple games to start the season and things can get skewed. And I guess the final point is that excites me as we look at this is we talked at the beginning of the show about how they were chasing so many key position groups for many, many years. And now I feel like they're getting ahead of the curve. When you start to look at what people are saying about the 2025 draft and where it's strongest, It's once again, it's receiver. So if there is an issue with DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett hangs him up, or you need to move on from there's another strong receiver class coming. It's supposed to be a stronger inside linebacker group. And in particular, the thing that I keep reading is how good the defensive line class is in this class. And in particular with guys that play on the interior and are 320, 330, legit bigger run wall type guys. If that's truly how Mike Macdonald wants to continue to build his team. So a chance now to kind of get ahead of the curve and add to strengths as we look ahead to next year.
It's so interesting, and their position, one more draft can really take this thing to another level. And if they can get like that next edge rusher or really build up that defensive line even further, that's what. And I was so critical of Schneider between the years probably of 17 to 21. It felt like every year they were just scotch taping their roster together.
Mm-hmm.
And they had no what I would call sustainable position groups. And that's where at 21 is where I thought the whole thing was going to fall under. And if they don't make that Russell Wilson trade, it would have. That roster would have blown up. Yeah. And because if they don't have the 5th overall pick last year or whatever, they've now have sustainable groups at corner, potentially offensive line, receiver, defensive tackle, defensive end. These groups are built for the next year, 1 to 3 years. And you're not going to have to go into free agency and be like, all right, who's my outside linebacker next year? You're just trying to fill the middle of your team, probably the least important position groups, and just add to what you already have. So sustainably building is what Baltimore does so well. It's what the sustainably teams that win. It's not just having a quarterback. It's everything around them. And it's more than just drafting. You got to do well in free agency now. You got to find value players. Cincinnati's done a really good job of it. And Detroit, the last couple of years, that's what they've done. And all of a sudden, Seattle's roster has gone from what I thought was a total mess to a group that a lot of people in the league think this is the up-and-coming team. If either Geno takes that step or they find a new quarterback, and all these young guys, some of them take a big jump this year, that what you said is so true. They now have the roster of a team that could take a totally different level where they were trending to a rough place, man.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I guess I would say is when you look at that future roster, it sure doesn't look like an offseason next year in which they're going to have to be concerned with going out big game hunting on the free agent market, which isn't normally their style anyway, but it doesn't seem like they'll be in that type of desperate position. That's Jeff Simmons, co-host of Real Hawk Talk, over the next month until training camp starts on July 17th. How do you guys handle the next month?
I'm not sure. I'm going to have to spend as much time outside and off of Twitter or X that I can. Because every time I go on there, I have some like the For You pages, like all these like weird fantasy football projections for like dynasty leagues. And like, I'm reading these every day. I'm like, they have no clue what's going on. And one day I almost like threw on like a broadcast of the draft just to like relive the Byron Murphy moment. I'm like, all right, this is too far. I'm like, I need something else to do. So yeah. I'm going to have to just try to take a hiatus for the next 4 weeks. And camp starts like July 17th, I believe the rookies report.
Yeah, rookies report. And then the 21st, I think for all of them. Yeah, it'll be here quick.
Exactly. It'll be here quick. Maybe I can get into golf, but I don't know.
Well, it's good to have you on. We'll get you back when the bullets are actually flying. Jeff, thanks again, and enjoy the next month.
Yeah, you too, Dan.
All right, man. This will be a fun one to look back on later on, and have this discussion. This will be probably a June tradition now where we kind of reset after minicamp when you're in that dead month heading into the season of how things stack up moving forward, because this is how front offices look at their roster, right? John Schneider has talked about how they have boards in their offices projecting out 25, 26, 27. So when they make moves, they don't just make them for the moment and then hope for the best in the future. They're looking at how it impacts next year and the year after and beyond. So we'll have to check back in and see how some of this stuff develops. Until then, you can follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Many, many thanks again for supporting the show. I know this is a slower time. I'm trying to get as much cool content out there for you as possible. One thing to keep a lookout. If you haven't checked out the Hawk Zone Rundown podcast yet, couple of guys I've become friends with and done some crossover episodes with on their show, Bryce and Ryan. They do such a tremendous job, and they are really doing some great work over there, getting some great guests on there, some really cool conversations. Give their channel a look and hit a sub, and they need subscribers. They deserve more subscribers. But we did a show yesterday looking at the all-time Seahawks roster. We built a 2-deep roster from every position, looking back over the entire history of the Seahawks. That's going to hit their channel tomorrow. And then I'm also going to host it on my channel. So you can view it here as well. But I really want you to get over there and give them a subscription too. So check that out. Until then, forever and always, go Hawks.